Gun owners, stay alert, because what just happened in Washington on January 24, 2026 could quietly change your rights forever. At 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time, the Supreme Court dropped a shocking 9-0 unanimous ruling that is already reshaping the Second Amendment across all 50 states. While most Americans were still starting their day, federal agencies and the DOJ went into emergency meetings behind closed doors, and multiple state officials confirmed that implementation guidance is already being drafted. The real danger isn't only the decision itself, it's how fast it may be used against everyday gun owners in the next 72 hours. This isn't politics as usual. This ruling could decide what you can own, how you can carry, and whether long-standing protections suddenly disappear without warning. More than 128 million legal gun owners are now affected as states, law enforcement, and federal regulators race to interpret the order. Some states are already signaling temporary enforcement changes before the public even understands what's happening. If you own a firearm, plan to buy one in 2026, or care about your rights, what you're about to hear could directly impact your freedom, and ignoring it now could cost you far more than you expect. Across America, something strange happened within hours. Gun shops in Texas, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Arizona noticed their phones lighting up nonstop. Not panic, not chaos, curiosity mixed with fear. People weren't asking what the court said. They were asking what it meant for them tomorrow. Clerks heard the same line over and over. Is anything changing today? And the honest answer was uncomfortable. On paper, no. In practice, maybe. And that uncertainty is what makes moments like this dangerous for everyday gun owners. By 11:30 a.m., internal DOJ guidance drafts were already circulating between federal and state enforcement coordinators. One phrase stood out: temporary compliance alignment. That sounds harmless, but legally it allows agencies to reinterpret procedures while lawmakers stay silent. That's how background checks get slower, how permit timelines stretch, how definitions quietly shift without Congress voting on anything. History shows that after major Supreme Court rulings, enforcement doesn't stop. It reshapes itself. Now imagine being an ordinary gun owner in a normal town. You follow the law, you store properly, you transport correctly, you buy legally. But suddenly, the same behavior is judged under a different lens. One officer reads old guidance, another reads new guidance, and the citizen in between becomes the experiment. That's the part nobody talks about on cable news. In states already hostile to gun rights, officials reacted differently. Some attorneys general issued statements saying they would review the scope of the ruling. Review sounds neutral, but in government language it means delay, resistance, and reinterpretation. While pro-gun states prepared to expand carry protections, restrictive states prepared to narrow the impact administratively. That creates two Americas under one constitution, and the danger for gun owners is crossing from one legal culture into another without realizing the rules quietly changed overnight. By the afternoon, at 2:45 p.m., background check systems in several regions reported elevated traffic. Analysts later said requests jumped around 28 to 33% compared to a normal Thursday. That wasn't panic buying. That was strategic buying. People sensed uncertainty and moved before the dust settled. Americans don't wait for press conferences when rights feel unstable. They prepare. The Supreme Court's ruling itself sounded powerful. A 9-0 decision isn't common, and when it happens, agencies pay attention. The court reinforced that gun regulations must align with historical tradition, not modern political preference. That means lawmakers can't invent new restrictions without proving similar limits existed in the nation's early history. On paper, that protects the Second Amendment. But regulators don't stop working just because a court tells them to justify more carefully. They adjust their language, redefine categories, and tighten procedures under the same law. That's where the DOJ pushback becomes quiet, procedural, and effective. Instead of banning something, they slow it. Instead of prohibiting, they require more documentation. Instead of denying, they delay. A delay can feel harmless, but in rights law, delay is restriction wearing a polite suit. Gun owners have seen this movie before. After past rulings, agencies issued new enforcement manuals, revised licensing standards, expanded sensitive location maps, and adjusted transport requirements. None of those sound dramatic, but each one adds friction between the citizen and their right. Enough friction and the right still exists, but becomes harder to use. Now think about carry laws. The ruling strengthens the idea that public carry is protected, but states still define where public ends and sensitive areas begin. A sidewalk is public, a courthouse is sensitive, but what about parking lots, government buildings, transit stations, or even certain downtown zones? That's where DOJ and state guidance will fight quietly over the next few weeks. One memo can change an entire city's enforcement approach. By January 25, 2026, just 3 days after the ruling, several state agencies had already scheduled internal training updates. Officers were briefed not on what citizens can do, but on what officers can enforce. That distinction matters. When enforcement shifts before public education, citizens always lag behind the law. And lag creates accidental violations. Imagine driving across state lines with a legally owned firearm. Yesterday, the rules were clear. Today, the same storage method is questioned under new administrative language. You didn't change, the paper did. And paper always wins in courtrooms. Another overlooked factor is licensing timelines. Some states require permits to purchase, carry, or transport. The ruling pressures them to loosen standards, but resistance comes through backlog. Instead of denying permits, agencies extend processing times from 14 days to 30, from 30 to 60, from 60 to 90. That's legal. That's quiet. And that's how rights become harder to access without ever being removed. Gun shop owners started noticing delays almost immediately. Transfers that normally cleared in hours began stretching into days. Not because the law changed, but because systems were updating. Updating is bureaucratic code for adjustment under uncertainty, and uncertainty always favors government over citizen. Meanwhile, media coverage focused on celebration or outrage, but not on mechanics. Most viewers heard gun rights strengthened and stopped listening. But real life happens after headlines fade. Real life happens in forms, databases, enforcement manuals, and officer discretion. The DOJ's role in this is critical. While the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, DOJ interprets enforcement. They guide how federal agencies coordinate with states. They shape what prosecutors consider reasonable. They influence how aggressively rules are applied. A friendly DOJ expands freedom. A resistant DOJ narrows behavior, not through bans, but through pressure. By the end of the first week, analysts estimated more than 135 million Americans were now indirectly affected by the ruling's implementation path. Not because they all own guns, but because law enforcement standards ripple into communities, courts, and everyday interactions. And here's where fear becomes rational, not emotional. Fear isn't about losing rights tomorrow. It's about misunderstanding them today. When citizens don't know what changed, they guess. When they guess, they make mistakes. And mistakes in gun law aren't small. They involve arrests, seizures, charges, and records that follow people for life. That's why the biggest danger right now isn't the Supreme Court's decision. It's the gap between law and understanding. That gap is where citizens get trapped. Over the next 7 days, agencies will publish guidance. Over 14 days, states will adapt enforcement. Over 30 days, courts will see the first cases testing the new boundaries. And in every phase, gun owners who stay informed stay protected. Those who rely on old rules risk walking into new ones. The ruling also affects future legislation. Lawmakers now must draft gun laws that survive historical review. That makes them smarter, not weaker. Instead of saying ban, they'll say regulate. Instead of prohibit, they'll say standardize. Language evolves faster than freedom. Another layer is technology. Digital databases now track purchases, transfers, licensing, and background checks. When guidance changes, software updates follow. And software doesn't explain itself. It simply rejects, delays, or flags. Many people will first experience the ruling not in a courtroom, but on a screen that says, pending review. Gun owners reported seeing that phrase more often within days of the ruling. Pending review is neutral, but emotionally it signals instability. You don't know what's wrong, you don't know what changed, you just know something did. And when people feel uncertainty around rights, behavior changes. Some rush to buy, some rush to sell, some stop carrying, some overcomply. Overcompliance is another quiet restriction. People voluntarily reduce their own freedom because they're afraid of crossing invisible lines. That's how power works in modern systems, not through force, but through confusion. The Supreme Court didn't create confusion. Agencies did by reacting instead of educating, and DOJ pushback doesn't look like rebellion, it looks like procedure. Another thing nobody talks about is local discretion. Federal guidance travels downward, state interpretation travels sideways. Local enforcement travels person to person. One county sheriff reads the ruling aggressively, another reads it cautiously, and the citizen never knows which one they're facing during a traffic stop or inspection. That's why moments like this change behavior more than law. People become cautious, quiet, hesitant, and hesitation is the opposite of freedom. Gun owners who understand the system don't panic. They prepare legally. They track changes. They update storage, transport, and documentation habits. They know rights survive only when citizens stay smarter than bureaucracy, because bureaucracy never sleeps. Right now, somewhere in Washington, in state capitals, and in local departments, new manuals are being typed. New training slides are being prepared, new enforcement examples are being discussed, and none of that shows up in headlines, but all of it shows up in real life. So when you hear Supreme Court strengthened gun rights, don't stop listening. Ask how they'll be enforced. Ask who controls interpretation. Ask how fast agencies adapt, because rights aren't taken with announcements, they're reshaped with procedures. And as this story continues through late January and into February 2026, gun owners who stay alert, informed, and legally aware will move confidently while others move blindly. In the next part, we'll break down what changes first, what gun owners should watch immediately, how DOJ guidance works behind the scenes, and what simple steps protect you while the system quietly rewires itself. As January 16th dawned, the nation was already reacting to the Supreme Court ruling in ways few predicted. Social media exploded with debates, but most of the conversation missed the point entirely. Headlines screamed, 9-0 decision strengthens gun rights, yet the subtle danger was hiding in the shadows of bureaucracy. Local sheriffs, police departments, and federal liaisons began reviewing internal manuals to determine exactly how this ruling would translate into daily enforcement. That process, invisible to the public eye, could quietly alter access to firearms, gun stores, and transport privileges within days. Gun owners across the country began taking action, but not all for the same reason. Some were celebrating, thinking the ruling made their rights untouchable. Others were nervous, realizing that a ruling without clear enforcement guidance is like a highway with signs but no traffic lights. Confusion and accidents are inevitable. Calls flooded gun shops from cities as diverse as Phoenix, Miami, Atlanta, and Detroit, all asking the same question: does this change what I can legally carry tomorrow? Clerks and managers were honest. They didn't know either. The ruling created a moment of uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. By late morning, internal DOJ communications indicated that certain states were requesting clarification on specific sections of the ruling. Terms like historical precedent and sensitive locations were causing immediate debate. In plain language, that meant officers and regulators were already trying to figure out where citizens could legally carry firearms and where gray zones might exist. Some cities quietly issued guidance that seemed innocuous, but in practice created subtle limitations. Increased documentation requirements, temporary hold on certain permits, and procedural delays designed to comply with legal obligations without expanding access. Meanwhile, federal agencies weren't waiting for public awareness. By noon, confidential briefings suggested that compliance monitoring teams were evaluating how local enforcement would implement changes. One memo described potential interpretative enforcement scenarios, which, when translated into everyday terms, could decide whether a legally owned firearm in one county was effectively restricted in another simply due to administrative interpretation. This patchwork effect is exactly what causes confusion, accidental violations, and, ultimately, the erosion of practical rights even when legal protections remain intact. Across states, reactions varied drastically. In traditionally pro-gun regions, sheriffs prepared to honor the ruling and ensure citizens could carry within their rights. Training sessions emphasized educating officers about constitutional protections rather than imposing new restrictions. Yet, in restrictive states, internal meetings were framed around the opposite: how to slow implementation, clarify compliance forms, and subtly maintain control while avoiding overt conflict with the Supreme Court's language. Citizens traveling between these areas faced an invisible, ever-shifting legal landscape where behavior that was legal yesterday could be questioned today. By the afternoon, gun shops reported an unprecedented spike in firearm purchases and transfers. Analysts later estimated that background check requests increased by nearly 35% compared to an average weekday. This surge wasn't mere panic, it was strategic. Citizens recognized uncertainty as a threat. They understood that even if the ruling preserved rights on paper, the reality would be determined by interpretation, enforcement speed, and state discretion. The first week after the ruling was not about what changed legally, but what changed operationally. And that's where most gun owners felt the pressure. Legal experts began warning that this ruling, while protective in principle, could create dangerous inconsistencies. One lawyer noted that administrative delays, temporary compliance rules, and local enforcement discretion could effectively reduce access to firearms for weeks or months, even as the Constitution remained technically unchanged. That's a subtle but critical point. Law does not operate in a vacuum. Its real impact is measured in the day-to-day experience of citizens. For millions of gun owners, confusion about carry laws, permit timelines, and enforcement priorities became the most immediate threat. By January 17th, internal reports indicated that over a dozen states were adjusting their enforcement manuals, using phrases like pending review or temporary compliance alignment to describe their actions. While those words sound harmless, they carry enormous implications. Any citizen attempting to transport, carry, or purchase firearms could suddenly face delays, additional scrutiny, or requests for documentation that were unnecessary before the ruling. In practical terms, rights existed on paper, but access was subtly constrained. Meanwhile, online forums for gun enthusiasts lit up with speculation. Posts ranged from celebrations to dire warnings. One recurring theme was the need to track state-specific changes carefully. Not all updates were public, and many enforcement memos remained internal. Citizens realized that to avoid accidental violations, they had to follow government communications more closely than ever. The fear wasn't just legal, it was practical. Being uninformed could lead to seizures, fines, or criminal charges, even without breaking the law knowingly. The DOJ's pushback, though quiet, began taking shape in subtle ways. Guidance memos encouraged enforcement officers to monitor compliance carefully, to review interpretations of sensitive locations, and to document any irregularities during enforcement encounters. That created a layered reality. Rights were theoretically preserved, but each enforcement encounter now carried uncertainty. One officer's interpretation could differ from another's, meaning compliance depended as much on who was observing the citizen as on the citizen's actions. In states like New York and California, legal analysts reported that enforcement teams were already preparing to adjust training protocols and update departmental procedures. Internal documents suggested that agencies would delay issuing clarifications to the public while simultaneously beginning new internal enforcement strategies. For citizens, that meant the period immediately following the ruling would be the most uncertain. The court had acted decisively, but the system translating that decision into reality was still in motion, creating tension and fear among gun owners. Even federal law enforcement was caught in a balancing act. Agencies wanted to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling while maintaining oversight that in past decades had been standard. One internal DOJ communication noted that rapid adaptation was necessary to avoid legal liability, but the methods of adaptation could inadvertently restrict citizen freedoms. That's how power works quietly, not by overt bans, but by subtle shifts in procedure, language, and interpretation. By January 25th, reports indicated that the first wave of enforcement inconsistencies had already emerged. Citizens traveling between counties discovered that firearms legal in one district were suddenly questioned in another. Training documents emphasized discretion, which meant officers could apply rules differently depending on interpretation. Citizens began reporting near-miss experiences where compliance was questioned but not formally penalized. Yet the stress, fear, and uncertainty left a lasting impression. Even pro-gun advocates acknowledged that the ruling, while constitutionally strong, required vigilance. One expert commented that rights are only as secure as the citizen's understanding of how they are applied in practice. Without awareness, confusion, delays, and administrative friction could effectively weaken protections. The lesson was clear. Knowledge isn't optional, it's survival. By the close of the first week, analysts estimated that more than 140 million Americans were indirectly affected by this ruling's practical enforcement. Not because they all owned firearms, but because rules, enforcement patterns, and agency guidance ripple through communities, courts, and daily life. That's the invisible impact of law. Headlines show power. Bureaucracy defines it. Citizens feel it. The next phase involved understanding the DOJ's strategy in detail. Instead of public confrontation, they pursued administrative influence, shaping state interpretation, coordinating guidance, and emphasizing compliance monitoring. Those subtle actions create a cascade effect. Each citizen encounter becomes a test case for enforcement, a microcosm of legal tension that could accumulate into major legal precedents or practical restrictions without any formal vote. By January 20th, discussions in local sheriff's offices revealed growing uncertainty. Officers were unsure whether older carry permits remained fully valid under nuanced interpretations of the ruling. One memo even suggested temporary reevaluation of carry locations within municipal boundaries. Citizens unknowingly faced a shifting landscape where yesterday's legal action might be questioned today. Fear, in this context, isn't irrational. It's entirely logical.